to this class. I want to start off by thanking the Almighty for giving us the beautiful holiday of Chanukah. We're going to be discussing that today. It's part of our week-long set of shiurim, all about the holiday of Chanukah. So thank you, God, for giving the Jewish people this lovely holiday of Chanukah. I want to thank the Hanhala of Yeshivat Machon Meir and all the Rabbanim over there in Israel offering classes throughout this week. I want to thank Rabbi Alt of Gulf Manor Synagogue for making all the arrangements on our side. I want to thank Achihud Tyler Cox of Yeshivat Machon Meir for all of his instrumental help in making this happen. Achihud, you did it at Sukkot time. You're doing it again now. For Chanukah, may you continue to make this beautiful arrangement between Yeshivat Machon Meir and Gulf Manor Synagogue for many, many healthy years to come. We really do enjoy having this beautiful setup. So a big thank you to you. I want to thank my wife, Alana, for allowing me all the time, that she always does, to prepare my various classes that I offer through Gulf Manor Synagogue, and this class especially. Thank you very much, honey. And I want to thank Rabbi Dr. Mark Shapiro, who I consulted a couple of months back and said, I'd like to talk about something about Chanukah, preferably not heretical. Do you have anything at all that I can speak about? And he sent me 3 ideas, and one of them is the one that we're going to be presenting today, which is why is the holiday of Chanukah not memorialized with a Masechta, with a tractate of its own in Mishnah? Why does the Mishnah lack a dedicated tractate, Masechta of Chanukah? Might as well jump into it. We all know that when it comes to the Jewish holidays, virtually all the other ones do have Masechtos. Let's lead off with the biggies. Rosh Hashanah has an eponymously named Masechta, Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur has Yuma, Sukkot has Sukkah, Pesach, of course, has Pesachim, and Purim has Megillah. And I would imagine that Shavuos and Shmini Atzeres are not terribly, I hate to say this, but they're not terribly distinguishable. They're Yom Tov, but there's nothing really stands out about them that you've got to do, like you got to do on Pesach, Korban, eat matzah, Manor, and so on. Purim's got its holidays and halacha. So why not Chanukah? It's a fairly distinct holiday, and why would it not be the case that it should have its own dedicated tractate? Okay, now there's a very, very famous, I also want to thank Rabbi, as I'm thanking Rabbi Dr. Mark Shapiro for the article, I might as well let you know the name of the article and who the author is. It's only right. I've been quoting him so much. Let me make this very clear. You can see it. Rabbi Eliezer Brat wrote the article. It's called The Chanukah Omission. It's a very long and detailed and footnoted piece. If anybody would like to see it, I'll be happy to email it to you. All right. There's a very, very famous reason that circulates around when it comes to this question as to why it is that Chanukah does not have its own Mishnaic tractate. Let me read you a little bit. And of course, if anybody has any questions at all, just jump in whenever you'd like. This is it's supposed to be interactive. Let me read you a little bit from Rabbi Brat's article, and then I'm going to give you a Ramban, Nachmanides. He says, one of the most famous answers given to this question was by the Chassam Sofer, who was quoted in a Sefer Chut HaMeshulash to have, and I'm going to keep everything in English. He's quoted to have said as follows. The Nes of Chanukah is not mentioned at all in the Mishnah, and the reason given is from our holy rabbi, meaning the Chassam Sofer. I'm sorry, that Rebbe HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, was Masad of the Mishnah. He was the one who distilled the Mishnah into a writing. Okay, and he was Mizera David HaMelech. He was from the stock of King David, and the Nes Chanukah was done as a result of the Chashmonayim, the Hasmoneans, and they were from, of course, Shevet Levi. They were Kohanim, and they grabbed the Melucha. They grabbed the kingship, and they were not from Zerah David. Okay, and that was ill. That was bad in the eyes of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and so when he wrote the Mishnah through Ruach HaKodesh, he left out the Nes of Chanukah from his Chibur, from his writing, which is of course the Mishnah, and that is a reason that is attributed to the Chassam Sofer. Others bring this answer without giving a source. Rabbi Eliezer Brat writes, the statement generated much controversy where many went so far as to deny that the Chassam Sofer said such a thing. The bulk of the issues with this answer were dealt with by Rabbi Moshe Tzvi Neria in an excellent article on the topic. That's footnote number 17. I'll just give you the name of the Sefer so you can go right there if you'd like to, in the Sefer Shana B'Shana in 1988, and also included in his Tznif Melucha. Okay? The most obvious question having to do with this is that Chanukah is indeed mentioned a little bit in the Mishnah, in passing, in a Mishnah in Bava Kama in the 6th chapter, in regards to damages. And Chanukah comes up with all things. But the fact is that Chanukah per se, what's the miracle? What's going on with it? It's not there treated in the Mishnah. It is, of course, a brisa in Gemara Shabbos, but it was not put into the Mishnah. Okay? And the explanation of the Chassam Sofer seems to be based in part on Nachmanides. Okay? On the Ramban. And he writes over here, not everybody agrees to this Ramban. Let me give you Rabbi Dr. Chevel's translation. We'll keep everything in English for economy's sake. In times there's so much I want to give you. And we're translating it all out of the Hebrew. We'll keep everything in English to keep everybody on the same page. Let me just read you a little bit from the Ramban. This is Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, where Jacob is on his deathbed. He's blessing his children, and he is talking to Yehuda. Yehuda gets at minimum 3 psukim, and one of them is Yosef Shevet Yehuda. The scepter of kingship is not going to leave Judah. So let me read you the Ramban. Okay? This is also the reason for the punishment of the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim, who reigned during the Second Temple. They were saints of the Most High, without whom the learning of Torah and the observance of the commandments would have been forgotten in Israel. So they were great. Despite this, they suffered such great punishment. The 4 sons of Matisyahu, Hachashmonai, saintly men who ruled one after another, in spite of all their prowess and success, fell by the sword of their enemies. And ultimately, the punishment reached the stage where a rabbi of blessed memory said, quote, he who says, I come from Beis Hachashmonayim, I come from the Hasmonean house, he's a slave. Because they were all destroyed on account of this sin. They usurped, as Levium, they usurped the kingdom. It's only meant for the stock of Judah. The Davidic dynasty has got to sit on the throne of the Jewish people, not Levium, even though they're very chashuv people, and they serve in the Mishkan, later on the Beis Hamikdash, the Kohanim, nobody's denying their importance, but they're not kings, they're priests. And of course, my theory is, if I can be so bold, obviously somebody's got to stand up. If nobody was standing up from Judah, so then the Levium stand up. So Mil Hashem Elai comes from Levi. Nothing wrong with that. It sounds like our Sinai all over again. But at a certain point, the Levium, these tzaddikim should have said, well, it's not right that we're in charge of the kingdom. We've got to hand that over to our brothers from Shevet Yehuda and let them run the show. But they never ultimately did that, it seems, and they were finally punished. They were passing away. They were killed by their enemies, rendered into slaves, destroyed, says the Ramban, on account of this sin. Now, although among the children of Shimon, there was cause for punishment because of the Sadducees, all the children of the righteous Matisyahu, the Hashmonai, were deposed for this only. They ruled even though they were not part of the seed of Judah and the house of David. And therefore, they completely removed this notion of the shevet, the scepter, and the lawgiver aspect from Judah. And their punishment was midah keneged midah, he says, measure for measure, because the Almighty caused their slaves to rule over them, and it is they who destroyed them. Mendel, you got a question? It's interactive. Go, Mendel.
And also, if they're
Clearly,
they're in power. The Levium, they're the Beis Hamikdash, and they basically are them.
They're going to be both in the Beis Hamikdash and the kings.
Yeah, the people in the Beis Hamikdash were the leaders and the big rabbis, and they would have power.
They would have monopoly power over everything. They would have been the kings. They would have been the priests. They would have been the teachers. They would have had everything.
Yeah. But they usually would have had they would have been the rabbis and
Can everybody hear Mendel?
They would have been the big scholars and the rabbis,
Right.
and they basically would teach the kings, and they probably were thinking we could not find any kings because they
Right.
may have been all killed or wiped out from the
Right.
Greeks.
Right.
So maybe we should take over, and if we find any, maybe we should help them.
Okay.
But they may have not found any, so that's maybe.
Okay. Well done. Thank you very much, Mendel, on that. Good point. Good, interesting point.
And if there were any kings,
Yeah.
they,
Mendel's gonna.
they may have not wanted to help them, or
You're going to be on YouTube forever,
and
Mendel, if you look into the
also,
camera.
become back, and they may have not wanted to help them get back,
Okay.
and they were lost. Then they may have not wanted to help them. They may have stole the power.
Okay.
They either wanted to steal the power,
Right.
or they may have thought we could not find any, so
Okay.
we may have just.
Good. Thank you very much. Good, interesting points over there. Talking about preventing a monopoly of power. The question is Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi the kind of person who would be so venal, is that the word? So petty, so childish, who would say, well, I come from Zerah David, I'm from David, and they're not. When I write my Mishnah, I'm going to leave them out. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was such a great man. It's inconceivable to understand how great he was. He didn't enjoy anything. He testified in his deathbed, I think. He didn't enjoy anything, even a pinky's worth of this world. Such a tzaddik, such a Talmid Chacham of such outstanding excellence. It's very, very difficult to ascribe such feelings of immaturity and just a general notion of, well, he's not from my Shevet, therefore I'm going to get back at him and I'm going to leave out their whole contribution to the Jewish people. I'm going to leave them out as my vengeance when I write my Mishnah. That just does not strike us as the kind of man Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was. And in a YouTube video, I did a lot of research. I even went to YouTube and I Googled up, why is Chanukah not mentioned in the Mishnah? And lo and behold, by Y.Y. Jacobson, a Lubavitcher, a very well-known speaker, he addresses it. And he says it's just impossible to think that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi would be that kind of a person, that he would to do such a thing like that. So rather, his theory is, according to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson of Chabad, that Chanukah was so beloved and such a well-known holiday on the part of the Jewish people that it didn't really even need to be written down. They basically knew everything they needed to know regarding the holiday of Chanukah, and therefore they kept Chanukah, and it did not need to be written down. That was Rabbi Schneerson's suggestion and teaching regarding why Rebbe kept the Mishnah clean and free of Chanukah. You think that it should be in there? Okay, it seems that Rabbi Schneerson is following the Rambam, if I can be so bold. And the Rambam, in his Pirush HaMishnayos, on Masechta Menachos, chapter 4, verse 1. And again, if you'd like, you can email me and we'll send you the article. Email me and I'll give you the sources that I may have come across on my own, but much of it is coming from Rabbi Bratt's article. Let me read to you, if I can, a little bit of the Rambam and his Pirush HaMishnayos on Menachos chapter 4, Mishnah 1. He writes as follows. So please bear with me. The laws of tzitzis, tefillin, and mezuzah, and the category of how to produce them. I translated this out of the Hebrew, so all the fault lies with me. I'm hoping that it's coherent. The laws of tzitzis, tefillin, mezuzah, and the idea, the concept, the category of how to produce them, these items, and the blessings that one is obligated to say over those items, and all the legal and halachic matters that are dependent on these topics, and what's discussed about them in the responsa literature. It's not correct or appropriate, according to the reception of our work here in the Mishnah, to discuss or talk about them, since the Mishnah is only an explainer or an explicator, and the Mishnah did not talk about these mitzvos, a specific word, in order to include their laws. Isn't that something? That when you take a look, you're looking for all the halachas of tzitzis and tefillin and mezuzah, don't go looking in the Mishnayos for that material. You may not find it over there. And the Rambam is going to give us an answer as to why it is. But he's saying it's not so unusual. Those are major items in the Jewish faith, and they're not making an appearance in the Mishnah. So to question me as to why Chanukah is not making it, you got tefillin, mezuzah, tzitzis. How do you go a day without any of that? And they're not there in the Mishnah. So what's up with that? And by the way, I found this girsa in Meseches. I personally, if I'm allowed to say this, I think it's a better girsa than Rabbi Brat's girsa in his article. It's a little bit clearer. A couple of words over here are a little bit clearer in the Mishnayos text. So I would recommend you take a look at his Pirush Mishnayos in the Mishnayos itself. Okay, so he's saying that the Mishnah comes as an explainer or an explicator of these materials, and it's not going to talk about it in the specifics unless it felt obligated to do that. And the reason for this, in my eyes, says the Rambam, is because these mitzvahs were well known in the time of the writing of the Mishnah, and these matters were well known and practiced in the hands of the nation, details as well as general rules. And no topic and no subjects were considered wondrous to anybody. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid chose not to discuss them. Just like he didn't set down the order of the prayers. Our liturgy, where do you find the nusach? He's going to mention the word nusach explicitly. Where do you find the nusach of Shacharis in the Yad HaChazaka? Where do you find that? The fact is, you don't find that, and you'd think that maybe you should, because after all, he's codifying things. He certainly codifies the Haggadah in Hilchos Pesachim, in the Yad over there in the halachos topic of Pesach. So if he's going to give me a text of the Haggadah to go on, how about Shacharis? You don't see that. He didn't set down the order of the prayers. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid did not do that in the Mishnah. Or how the leader, the shlich tzibur, the prayer should conduct himself, since it was well known. And so he didn't write a prayer book in the Mishnah, but instead he wrote a book of Talmud annex explanations. That's how the Rambam writes it. So therefore, Chanukah was so well known, it did not need a Masechta all its own. That's what Rabbi Schneerson is saying. Perhaps
Which Rambam is this, Shmuel?
That as well. Question?
Yeah, where is this Rambam? I missed the very beginning. It's in Menachos?
It's in Menachos, chapter 4, Mishnah Aleph, Mishnah 1.
It's his Perush, it's Perush HaMishnayos.
Yes, sir.
And what got the Rambam started? What's the first thing that he?
Oh, there's a whole lot of Torah over there and the Mishnah over there. I don't have that in front of me right now.
Sure,
but
okay, no worries.
And he launches from the discussion that he's doing on the Mishnah, launches into this. Forgive me that it's not in my head at the moment.
No worries.
Okay. Rabbi Brat in the article then writes down a couple of critiques of this Maimonidean approach. And he quotes Rabbi Yaakov Shor in his Mishnas Yaakov, who says, "Oh, Rambam, really? I mean, you think that mezuzah and tefillin and tzitzis, they don't deserve their own treatment? They're so simple." He says the laws of tefillin are actually very complicated, Rabbi Shor writes, with many details, and certainly more complex than Kriya Shema, which does indeed get its own Masechta, which we call brachos. There's a lot of talk about Kriya Shema and Masechta Brachos, my friends. And Kriya Shema, you could argue, is somewhat straightforward. You have to read 3 chapters of the Bible to fulfill a mitzvah. When do you do it? Okay, that needs a Mishnah. And another Mishnah, I get it. Okay, a whole chapter. Okay, a whole Masechta. So if you're going to give a whole Masechta for reading Kriya Shema, how about a whole Masechta for tefillin? Well, that makes some sense, doesn't it? And so therefore, Rabbi Shor writes that, you know what? There actually was a Masechta Sofrim dedicated to the laws of tefillin, and it's now lost. But it forms the basis of our contemporary Masechta Sofrim. Unfortunately, there are going to be, Rabbi Shor, certainly going to be an advocate of the position that we may have lost some materials along the way, which is a very sad reality.
Maybe Rome may
Mendel.
have them.
Maybe Rome may have them. Well, and Mendel makes a good point. He knows that the Roman Catholic Church is in possession of a lot of things and a lot of our books. When they weren't burning our Sfarim, they were stealing our Sfarim. And so they've got quite a library of Judaica, no question about it. And Kitvei Yad, manuscripts. So maybe they have some stuff that we're missing.
And forks and spoons.
And of course, forks and spoons, but we're not going to go there. I know that's fascinating to everybody. That's going to be a different topic. Okay. So there is an approach. There was indeed, yes, indeed, a Masechta Chanukah. He writes the Rishonim refer to 7 minor Masechtos. But not all the Rishonim agree that what we have today are those very same exact 7, Masechtos that the Rishonim refer to as the 7 minor Masechtos. Now, the son of the Vilna Gaon, if anybody can speak to this, you think the Vilna Gaon can, and he does. And it's the 300th anniversary of the Gra, so it's all good that we here quote the Gra. We had the great schus of having a Shabbaton in the honor of the Gra. Recently, Rabbi arranged that. Rabbi Bax, thank you, Tyler, for introducing us to Rabbi Bax. He spoke, Rabbi Brolov spoke. It was a really beautiful thing. So honored the Gra. And the son of the Gra is quoting his father. Here's what he writes in Rav Ufa'olim. In truth, I heard from my master, my father, the Gaon, that there are 7 small tractates outside of those found among us. And they are Mesechtos, watch this, Mesechtos Tefillin, Tractate Tefillin, Tractate Chanukah, and Tractate Mezuzah. Wow. So according to the Gaon, you have a source, his own son says, Daddy said that there are 7 minor Mesechtas out there, and one of them is Mesechta Chanukah. One is Mesechta Tefillin. One is Mesechta Mezuzah. So you see that the Gra held that there was a Mesechta Chanukah, Rabbi Brat writes. Could be there was, he writes, and it got lost. Hard to know these things. It requires more and more research, which is what we're here for, to give you some basics, and then you dive in. But the Gaon was of this opinion. And he quotes Rabbi David Luria. Listen to this. Rabbi David Luria, the Radal, who quotes about a story from the Gaonic times, from the Shuvas of the Gaonim, that there was a very learned man, a Zaken, a learned Talmid Chacham, who appeared in a yeshiva in the times of the Gaonim, which century within the Gaonic period, which went from like the 700s to about the year 950, 1,000, I mean, roughly 300 to 400 year period of the Gaonim. That's the general period. So the Radal says that there's a story out of the Gaonim that there was a very learned man who made an appearance, gave a drasha, and it appeared, listen to this, that he had, now you better seatbelt yourself in for this one. He had an additional Seder of Mishnah in his hand, but nobody could copy it. V'lo yochlu lahatikoto, words to that effect. Why? The visitor had a sibato gedolah. He had a long-winded reason why you can't borrow my book that I've got, that I'm holding on to for dear life. And he was hasty to have to leave. He had to check out. So sadly, they were not able to look at it, well, and give it a good hard look and maybe send somebody in there to be a copyist of it. Okay, so there you see, this is kind of troubling in a way. Here's a man in the Gaonic period who is walking around, and great scholars are able to say, that looks like Mishnayos, and we don't recognize that Mishnayos. He has something, and he's not sharing, and he's going to walk out of here, and we're not going to have it. And that's not good. I don't know what to make of that, because is that the 7th Seder of Mishnah? Far be it for me to make any kind of deductions or conclusions. This is for people far above my pay grade, but I'm letting you know what Rabbi Brat writes. He's quoting the Radal from the Gaonic times. They saw somebody and he had material that they were not familiar with, and it looked of Mishnaic origin, and they could not successfully copy it. Were there additional Masechtas, therefore that are no longer extant? You could make that argument. Possibly. Okay. I want to thank Rabbi Old for sharing and providing me with Sifsei Chaim. in the article, Rabrat says that there are various reasons given among the great scholars of the Jewish people as to why Chanukah did not merit to be given a Masechta of its own. And one of them is from Rabbi Chaim Friedland, Mashgiach Ruchni of the Panovich Yeshiva back in the day. And in his Sefer Sifsei Chaim, 2-volume set, in the second volume, he distinguishes between Purim and Chanukah. I'll read it in English. Let me read you the little piece about Purim, and then you'll appreciate the Chanukah aspect of it. And he makes an attempt, a valiant effort to explain to us why Chanukah does not merit to get into the Mishnah. He writes as follows: the miracles of Purim came from an awakening from above. And they were represented, or they came from the source of a posture of Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah, as opposed to the miracles of Chanukah, which God did only after there was an awakening down below, here on earth, represented by the oral law, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, writes Rabbi Friedland. Now here's the Purim thing. All the mitzvahs of Purim, even if they are rabbinic, in truth, they were written in the biblical book of Esther, one of the canonical works of the written Torah, which book, Esther, was given to us by God due to this heavenly awakening. We find that besides the biblical book of Esther itself, also there are commandments of Purim established by our Chachamim, established by our sages, who are written within the parameters and within the borders and the Gedarim, he writes, of the written law. Yemei Mishta, days of joy and partying, Matanos Lavyonim, Mishloach Manos. Those words, those mitzvahs come up explicitly written into our canonical book of Esther. Now, are they explicated by the rabbis? They always are, but they certainly make an appearance in the written in the Bible. They're right there in the book of Esther. And by virtue of this, that they're in the Torah Shebiksav, the sages taught us the essence and the nature of the holiday of Purim, that it comes to us from above. The Almighty was awakened, if you will, Kivyachol. There was an awakening up in heaven. A Ra'ash came up in heaven to save Klal Yisrael, and the Almighty came to the rescue and saved his nation. And it came from above. And he made of course, there was davening down here, but he was awakened, if you will. Hard to say that, but let's go with that idea. That there was, human beings have to speak in some terminology. So there was an awakening above and there's an awakening below. So what's about Chanukah? Yeah, there's an awakening below, and it's represented by the oral law, by the Torah Sheba'al Peh. What's pshat with that? What does that mean? He writes, Rabbi Friedland writes, however, all the mitzvahs of the days of Chanukah were written only in the oral law, in the Torah Sheba'al Peh, in the rabbinic writings. They're not in any biblical book. Moreover, even though the relevant oral law about Chanukah was indeed written in the Mishnah and Brisa, as we say in the law, it was distilled into a writing. There was obviously traditions. It's a Brisa. You see it come up in Gemara Shabbos. We all know this. So eventually it was distilled into a writing. It made black letters on one page, but still, Rebbe decided that it's not going to be canonized into the Mishnah. It stayed for as long as it could orally. And even though ultimately it makes an appearance in Braitot and in passing in that Mishnah in Bava Kama, it comes up, I get it. But still, in all, our sages left over the mitzvahs of Chanukah in an oral, unwritten fashion, he writes. Indeed, he writes, in all the 6 orders of Mishnah, the laws of Chanukah are not written. And even the actual substantive reality of Chanukah itself is not mentioned at all. That is left for my Chanukah. That was a brisa, but that was kept in an oral way, an oral fashion, mouth to mouth, taught as long as humanly possible, until it was ultimately written down, so it shouldn't be forgotten. That's my little addition to it. But as long as humanly possible, it was in an oral, unwritten form. Even the substantive reality of Chanukah itself. What was the story? What happened? Who did what? Who was the bad guy? Who are the good guys? What do they do? None of that comes up. in any biblical book at all. It makes its way, yes. Mendel is pointing me to the Apocrypha. And yes, and he's showing it. Thank you, Mendel. Yes, it is in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. That's true. But the rabbis felt that those books were not written with sufficient Ruach HaKodesh, and therefore they did not make it into the biblical canon. So they are good sources of history, but they are not written Ruach HaKodesh, and we therefore do not give them the kind of respect. We don't read them publicly in shul on Chanukah like we do with other Megillot. So even though it's useful for our historical knowledge, it didn't make the cut into the biblical canon itself. Okay. So again, Chanukah is coming up in an oral capacity, in oral law, in the Torah Sheba'al Peh, in the rabbinical thought and teachings, and not distilled into a writing for as long as possible. All right. Even in the Brisos, only a little is written regarding the miracles of Chanukah and its laws, as the source discusses in the discussion of Gemara Shabbos. You only have a little bit. I mean, come on. At the end of the day, take a look at the Gemara over there in Shabbos, which everybody looks to for this Talmudical source for Chanukah. How long is that brisa? I don't know, 5 lines, 10 lines, 15 lines. It's not that long. Then you've got a little bit more about Chanukah elsewhere in the same chapter, and that's not very long. So there's really very, very little. It's very skimpy. Even when it's distilled into a writing, it's not a whole lot. The question is why? So Rabbi Friedman brings it all home. He writes, only in the Talmud are the laws of Chanukah explained and clarified. In so doing, our sages wanted to teach us that the virtue, that the merit of the Chanukah miracles and its commandments are a merit, they're a virtue deriving out of the oral law, which is, if you will, it's earthly, it's human, it's man-to-man talking and engaging in discussion and debate. I get it. It comes from Sinai. It's a tradition going all the way back to Moshe. We all understand that. But whether or not some of it was lost and had to be replaced or had to be relearned and rediscovered, it all comes down to our rabbis and students engaging in constant debate and conversation and discussion with each other. It's not merely sitting down with a text and looking at it, reading it, and putting it away on a shelf. It all comes down to discussion and debate. You can't learn Torah properly unless you're in a congregation of people and you're mixing it up and you're having your wrong ideas exposed and you're put on the straight and narrow. That comes from learning with a colleague. So all Chanukah derives its power and its very mahus, its whole essence, out of the oral law. Many other rabbis discuss this, not just Rabbi Friedland, but he's saying it nicely. Okay, and it comes out of the oral law, which they merited, which the Chashmonai merited, and Klal Yisrael continues to merit due to the awakening and the effort of Klal Yisrael. And so, if I may, that's why Chanukah was not written down in the Mishnah, because it is uniquely close to the Torah Sheba'al Peh. It is uniquely associated and related to Torah Sheba'al Peh. Therefore, Rebbe decided, I'm going to keep that going. I'm going to not distill Chanukah into a writing, because it has got to be oral in nature for Rabbi Friedland. It's got to maintain that beautiful virtue and merit. It derives out of the power of the oral law, and it should thereby stay so. And it should remain in an oral capacity. Obviously, it has to get distilled into a writing sometime, so we shouldn't forget it. But this was Rebbe's attempt to keep it out of the Mishnah in an effort to show you that it derives out of the oral law, and we have to keep it in that that thought, if you will. Okay, it's all about human initiatives. All right, Torah Sheba'al Peh is also a product of human initiative. The debates in the Mishnah and the Talmud reflect human effort to get to the truth, to recover and to recapture all those teachings from God to Moshe, which exist so long as we're able to have a living, and therefore this gives us a living, breathing, and eternal law which can respond to the challenges of the times. It has to be like that. Right now, we're in a presidential conundrum, and people say, okay, what does the Constitution say? So it's got some answers. This election may be over or may go to the House. So the Constitution as a human document is not a bad effort for human beings to do. Our Torah can be obviously no less. It's got to be a living, breathing document that responds to the Jewish people in every generation. And we have that power as a result of the Torah Shebaal Peh. So that's Rabbi Friedland's approach to why Chanukah is not put into the Mishnah, because it comes so deeply out of the Torah Shebaal Peh idea and stadium of thoughts that therefore it has to remain like that, and therefore it's not put into a written form. Okay, I got a little bit more for you. I think I'm doing okay. Some people talk about Megillus Tainus. And
Shmuel, you're doing great. You're doing great. Not just okay. But I think now is a good chance maybe to just pause for 1 minute.
Sure.
And recap. So far, I think I've heard you say 3 different approaches to why Chanukah does not have a Masechta. You have the Chassam Sofer, that it's to get back at the Hashmonaim for taking the kingdom when the kingship when they wasn't their place. So they don't deserve a Masechta. There's the Rambam that
very well known.
Simple things do not need a Masechta. And then we have now our Chaim Friedlander and perhaps others that it's meant to be Torah Shebaal Peh because of the nature of Chanukah itself, and therefore the more oral it can be, the better. And I skipped one, of course, which is the Vilna Gaon and some other that Radau, that there actually is a Masechta Chanukah. That's approach number 4, and it's just one of the Mesechtas that was lost. So I got 4 approaches. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Very well done. Better than I could have done it because my head is so in the grass that I can't seem to get above and look at this whole thing from the trees. So thank you.
Okay.
Oh, boy, what if I drop a bomb on everybody and talk about Megillus Tainus? What is Megillus Tainus? I'm going to read a little bit to you from the Encyclopedia Judaica, so we'll have some basis, and we're going to then bring it all home. There's a little bit more, obviously. I'm not going to belabor this point. It is interesting. But you have to know what Megillus Tainus is. And once you do know what Megillus Tainus is, then boy, oh boy, you're going to be shocked to hear some more theories. Gentlemen and ladies who are joining us, what is Megillus Tainus? It's the Megillah, the scroll of fasting is what the term means, Megillus Tainus. It is a document coming from the Mishnaic times, from the Tannaitic times. It is dated back to roughly the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. At the latest, written during the Bar Kokhba era, so the times of the Second Temple destruction, that is around the year 70 of the Common Era. And then 60 years or so later, 135 of the Common Era, 65 years later, Bar Kokhba's rebellion did not work out ultimately. The Romans came and defeated Bar Kokhba and the Jewish people. And so some scholars, I'm reading from an academic scholarly work, obviously, they're of the opinion that the Megillus Tainus was written between the year 70 of the Common Era and the Bar Kokhba rebellion. That's going to be important. So you got to hold your head and remember that period of time. We had just lost to the Romans in round 1 in the year 70, and it was a terrible loss. Much destruction, many deaths. But then the Jews come back strong under Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Akiva thinks he's the Messiah. Wow. And he's winning wars against the Romans. Ultimately, it goes south. But for a while there, things are good. Again, Megillus Tainus is a listing of 36 days on which there were significant victories and happy events in the history of the Jewish people during the Second Temple. Now, as a result of which, all these happy days, the Jewish people had such happy days, and the rabbis forbade fasting on those 36 days, and there's in other cases as well. And therefore, you couldn't offer hespedim. And indeed, the brisa that we have in Gemara Shabbos talks about the Delola Mispad Bahon. You don't do any hespedim. We don't do any eulogies during the holiday of Chanukah because it's so joyous, and also other days as well
What?
in these listing of these days in Megillus Tainus. So unusually, the Megillus Tainus, the scroll of fasting, really ought to be called the scroll of not fasting,
What happened?
because you're not supposed to fast on the following 36 days.
Why did we lose that scroll?
We haven't lost that scroll. That's still with us.
Okay.
It is among the very earliest of the Tannaitic writings. Some say it is the earliest rabbinic writing distilled into a writing. Nothing comes before that that's of the Tannaitic or rabbinical nature. Megillus Tainus kicks things off when it comes to rabbinical writings. It's the earliest thing that we got. It is the earliest because if you're going to date it to the year 70 of the Common Era, or Bar Kochba 60 years later, that still gives you the year 130 or so. And the Mishnah was written down by Rebbe in the beginning of the 200s, the beginning of the 3rd century. So this truly is a very, very early piece of rabbinical writing. Okay? The work received its present form close to the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, so like we said, according to a Tannaitic source, Sigamar Shabbos 13b, it was compiled by Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Garon and his company. But the appendix to the Megillah gives the author as Eliezer, the son of Hananiah, who was one of the leading rebels against the Romans. For this, you got to see Josephus and his wars, chapter 2. It's a long chapter. Solomon Zeitlin, we have his book somewhere on my shelf, but let me tell you, I can't seem to find it right now. I mean, that fault lies with me. Zeitlin writes, he thinks that Megillus Tainus is a literary remnant of the rebel party. Now, listen to this. This is actually important. It's a literary remnant of the rebellious Jewish people who are rebelling against the Romans. If this is accepted, then the purpose of the list of victories, the reason why you're listing all these victories, was to strengthen the spirit of heroism and faith in the success of the revolt. The reason why they put this into a writing was to spread it around their people and say, listen, look at all these other times that we had great victories as Jewish people. This is also going to be a great victory. Let's stick this one out. And so they distilled it into a writing. I always keep on using that phrase, but I like it. Okay? It's a legal term. They put this into a writing in order to spread the idea that we're going to have a victory also, like our brethren did in centuries past. Okay, the encyclopedia writes that the value of Megillus Tainus, Megillat Ta'anit, for historical research, it lies in the parallels that it provides to the facts and the dates mentioned in Josephus. So my wife was so kind, she bought me a Josephus. It's a real big volume with lots of footnotes. It's a really highly recommended book. And if I had had the time, I would have done more research and I would have seen more. But this article hopefully is whetting your appetite. And we're learning something over here, that the value of Megillus Tainus for historical research is in that it parallels and provides facts and dates mentioned in Josephus. Okay? In the period following the conclusion of the Talmud, when was the Talmud concluded? 500, 550 of the Common Era, 600? That whole century could have been the time that we concluded the Talmud. A scholium was appended to the Megillah. In Hebrew, it's called the Scholion. And Vered Noam writes a very, very long piece about that in HTC Annual a few years ago, where she analyzes the Scholium to death. So the Scholium, this appendix to the Megillus Tainus, was added at the conclusion of the Talmud, and it's written in Mishnaic Hebrew. Okay? And we're told that the Megillus Tainus, the original Megillus Tainus, is written in Aramaic, and it's extremely brief, very, very much into brevity, extreme brevity. So the original document was very, very terse and written in Aramaic. The appendix, the scholium, this additional item that the rabbis appended onto Megillus Tainus at the end of the Talmudical era, the year 500, 550, and so on, that was written in Mishnaic Hebrew. And that, according to this, is based upon the Hebrew original of First Maccabees, Mendel. Mm-hmm. That's right, your apocryphal work. According to these scholars, when they take a look at the scholium, they see in the scholium written in Mishnaic Hebrew that it's based upon the Hebrew original of First Maccabees. Okay? The historical value of this appendix is limited, he says. And finally, in the course of time, copyists and editors added notes and explanations, in particular from the Babylonian Talmud, so that two versions evolved, a Sephardi and an Italian version. And then he goes through the encyclopedia, I'm not going to do it now, goes through a very, very long listing of many of the happy days that the Megillus Tainus mentions. Before the Hasmonean era, then from the Hashmonaic era, when the defenders of the Akka left Yerushalayim, and then the siege of the citadel of Tzor, Tzor conquered by Shimon the Hashmonai. There's a lot there. People, there is so much to look at. So see the Encyclopedia Judaica. Okay, and they also talk about the 25th of Kislev, Chanukah, for which festival the appendix mentions several reasons, including, watch this, that when the Hashmonayim were victorious and found all the temple vessels ritually unclean, quote, this is from the Megillus Tainus in the Scholium, they brought 7 iron spits, covered them with white metal, and commenced the lighting. And that, I think, is maybe coming out of second Maccabees. Okay, comes out of the biblical book of Second Maccabees, I believe. Fascinating stuff. So there's plenty over there to take a look at. Why am I mentioning all that? I could go on and on and on. You don't want me to do that. You can read that yourself. But what I will do for you is tell you that some theorize that Megillus Tainus, this very, very super early rabbinical writing about all the happy days that you're not supposed to fast on, that's the missing Masechta Chanukah. Because in Megillus Tainus, you have some treatment of Chanukah. There's no getting around it. I mean, there's stuff there that talks about the 25th of Kislev. There's no denying that. And so some want to argue, Rabbi Bratton, his article writes, that some want to take the position that when people talk about, I'm missing Masechta Chanukah, they actually mean Megillus Tainus. And that's also what, according to these people, that's what the Gra meant when he said the words Masechta Chanukah. He meant Megillus Tainus, because that is a work. Masechta Chanukah is obviously dedicated to Chanukah, and Megillus Tainus is a lot about Chanukah. So according to many scholars, many in the traditional camp, not about the academics, many in the frum camp can argue that the Gaon meant that Megillus Tainus is what the Gaon meant when he said, oh yeah, there was once a Masechta Chanukah. So that's what the Gaon meant. According to some, okay. Rabbi Schick in Torah Shleima writes that there was a Sefer Chashmonayim, which recorded the miracles written by Hillel and Shammai, and that's why there's no separate Mishnah. There was already a Sefer dedicated, and it's called Sefer Chashmonayim. So I looked up Sefer Chashmonayim, and it seems to be synonymous with the following, and many people have heard these: Megillas Antiochus, Megillas Chashmonayim, Megillas Chanukah, Megillas Yevanit. See, according to my Sefaria research, these 4 are all synonymous. They're all one and the same book. And they all recount the story of Chanukah and the history of the victory of the Maccabees over the Seleucid Empire. Early texts, these Megillas Antiochus, Megillas Chashmonayim, early texts are in Aramaic and Hebrew, but the Hebrew version, he says, is a literal translation of the Aramaic original. And watch this. This is an interesting historical thing. During the medieval period, during the Middle Ages, it was read aloud in Italian shuls on Chanukah, like Esther was read on Purim. That is to say, this work, Megillus Tainus, Megillus Chashmonayim, Megillus Chanukah, Megillus Yevanus, whatever you want to call that thing, that work, written between the years 100 before the Common Era and the year 700 of the Common Era, that is one timetable for when that work was written. Others say no, it's just from the 1st century of the Common Era to the 5th century of the Common Era. Okay, so that's obviously included in the first timetable. However you want to date it, goes back to around minimally 1,500 years to 2,000 years. It's not Megillus Tainus. It is a work that does discuss Chanukah in depth. And during the medieval period, it was read aloud in Italian shuls, and it still forms part of the liturgy of the Teimanim, of the Yemenite Jews. What do you say to that? Yemenite Jews are still utilizing that work, Megillas Antiochus, Hashmonayim, Chanukah, Yavanis, whatever you want to call it. That work is out there. People know of it. The Italian Jews used to read it publicly, and the Yemenite Jews still make use of it, though I'm not sure exactly how they do that. Okay. The Bahag was citing a source that the elders of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, they wrote this work, Megillat Beit Chashmonai. Okay, so that would make some sense that it goes back to the times of Hillel and Shammai, the schools of Hillel and Shammai, 100 years before the Common Era, going forward. And that the combined schools of Hillel and Shammai, they wrote that work, Megillas Antiochus, Megillas Chashmonai. Okay. Finally, Rabbi Brat brings down some correspondence between the Aderet and Rabbi Yaakov Kahana, who wrote She'elos Utshuvos Toldos Yaakov. And the Aderet writes that the famous Maritz Chayes, some say it was a shtickle maskil, a tremendous Talmid Chacham who was into historical research, and he was open to all kinds of things. So a very, very creative individual, and very well known in all circles, and highly regarded. And listen, he wasn't the only one who was dabbling in it. The Maritz Chayes was amazed why the Yerushalmi, why the Jerusalem Talmud does not mention Chanukah, except for in passing in Trumos. So the Adaris is wondering why the Maritz Chayes is amazed. Why is the Jerusalem Talmud not mentioning Chanukah? So Rabbi Kahana answers him, I'm not so bothered that the Mishnah does not mention Chanukah from Megillas Tainus, since the Bavli doesn't mention any of the incidences of Megillas Tainus. According to Rabbi Kahana, if you're going to look for the famous listing of all those happy, joyous occasions where we don't eulogize and we don't fast, mentioned in the iconically famous Megillas Tainus, that earliest writing, though I think Megillas Chashmonaim is also looking pretty old, but still, Rabbi Kahana says, I'm not so bothered that the Mishnah doesn't mention Chanukah, deriving from Megillas Tainus, because the Babylonian Talmud doesn't mention any of those incidents from Megillas Tainus. Rather, Rabbi Kahana says, I am bothered that the Yerushalmi omits it, since the Yerushalmi does mention other stories from Megillas Tainus. The Yerushalmi will mention other dates mentioned in Megillas Tainus, that very, very famous work with the 36 happy days. So Yerushalmi does mention some of those happy days. How come Yerushalmi does not mention Chanukah? It's also one of those happy days. Why is it silent? Good question. He's troubled by it. Okay, so Professor Louis Ginsburg is going to weigh in. He's the Eloi of Tells, who became famous for teaching at JTS for 50 years. But you know what? Mark Shapiro wrote a whole book about Saul Lieberman. He could also write a book about Ginsburg. Ginsburg was also very respected by all the Talmidei Chachamim of the day. I mean, obviously, they had it in for him for joining the conservative movement. But deep down inside, a guy who knew Kol Torah Kula, I mean, you got to watch what you say about him, because he knew so much. So Ginsburg writes, it's proper to make known that the Yerushalmi basically does not mention the laws of Chanukah at all, not in the words of the Tanaim or the Amoraim that appear in the Yerushalmi, but that it only appears in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud. And any mitzvahs which Israel sacrificed themselves were strengthened in their hands. That was Professor Ginsburg's contribution to the article of Rabbi Eliezer Brat. Okay, and finally I've got Rabbi Reuven Margolis, and he's going to give us a little bit of interesting stuff, and I hope that you can enjoy it. And I'm sorry if I'm always looking down instead of looking at my dear friends in the eye in the camera, but I want you to hear it. I'm not that good looking. There's no reason to look at me. Just listen to what he says. When Ptolemy commanded to copy the written Torah, to know what's in that written Torah of the Jews, the local area, the hegemonic area that he was in, was also intrigued to know about the traditions, the oral law that was affiliated with it. This request to also translate the oral law was liable to urge or stir up the leader of Israel to be encouraged to arrange in an open book the Torah of the Jews and their acceptance of the fundamentals of the oral law, and to confess and reveal that there was no insolent language against any nation or language or any political proclamation. You got that? You have to be careful. If you're going to be writing stuff that's been running around from person to man, rabbi to student, student to student, student to rabbi back to student, on and on and on, things are going to get picked up. Language is going to be used. And who in the world is going to want to memorialize maybe an insult against the king? You know, somebody makes a clever, snippy comment, and it becomes part and parcel of that whole discussion about that mitzvah, let's say. And you can't really understand the mitzvah and the discussion unless you bring in the insult against the local Greek king or the governor. Now, who in the world wants to write that? That's going to be so dangerous. So when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, this is a theory as to why he did not write down Chanukah in the Mishnah. When Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid considered that his book, the Mishnah, would be consulted by the leaders, the thinkers, the writers, the scientists, the readers of the day, the politicians, let's say, Anshe Mada, he writes, men of thought, science and politics and poetry and writing and the whole, whatever Greeks and Romans were into, when they would be in a position to look up his, what did I read? Oh, that leading rabbi. Oh, the 2nd century, such a great star in the sky. He wrote a distillation of Jewish law. Let's read that. Let's have that translated. Oh boy, you're going to really be walking into a minefield, if you'd have felt. I'm going to be writing stuff that might be potentially insulting to the local leadership for any reason. Could be somebody's going to get in there and they're not going to like it. Okay, these people stand outside Judaism, these leaders of the nations, and they would adjudicate their legal affairs before the king in Rome. And who needs the Mishnah to be a repository of potential insult to Greece or Rome? Nobody in his right mind wants that. So we can understand why he deleted from his Mishnah fundamentally important matters in the Torah of Israel. Since if he had written about Chanukah, it might have been understood as a political message. How? Think about it. I think I may have told everybody all in passing on a Shabbos as we were coming from shul. If you're going to sit down and write the following, let's talk about Chanukah, my Chanukah. Oh, 250, 300 years ago, our fellow Jews fought against the Syrian Greeks. And oh, did they wipe the floor with them? And you know how they did it? Oh, with bow and arrow and some slingshots and some rocks. You know, it's like, a small yeshiva going up against the U.S. Marine Corps and winning. Can you imagine the miracle? God made a miracle for us, and he beat down all those pagan gods. Oh, Zeus and Apollo are worthless. End of my story. Signed, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. Now, can you imagine a Roman guy reading in the year 200 that stuff? He says to himself, well, that's kind of incendiary. That is inflammatory. He's making fun of, maybe not us per se, but he's making fun of our intellectual forebears, the Greeks. We are eye to eye with those guys. We incorporated their architecture, a lot of their political thought. We love their literature. We adopt not every single thing that we adopt, but listen, we look to them as great models of oratory, rhetoric, logic, grammar, philosophy, the works, science. Come on. We're brothers. We're kinfolk with them. And this guy's making fun. He's making fun of my intellectual forebears, how a bunch of yeshiva guys, a bunch of Kohanim who didn't know their right foot from their left as they were marching. They were able to beat down one of the strongest armies in the world because their God beat down Apollo and Zeus. I can't stand reading this stuff. This is inflammatory. We got to bring that rabbi in for a little splaining to do, like Ricky Desi Arnaz would say to Lucy. You got some splaining to do, Rabbi. He would understand it as a political message, as a celebration of the national victory and our hope for freedom. And in the year 200, Jerusalem renamed Aelia Capitolina under a Roman boot. The city was completely paganized, and Jewish people were waiting and waiting for the Messiah to come and redeem us and rebuild the temple. I mean, it was bad in the year 200. How Rebbe had a friendship with the Romans and wrote the Mishnah, I'll never really understand. I don't think it was so pashut, and I don't think it was so simple back then. That's my little understanding of it. I'll leave you with this. That's why when I was in Israel, I was in Chappelle's, and our tour guide took us to the temple area, to the basement, to the Kotel area. We were allowed to go. And over there was inscribed into a rock the following. It was a pasuk from Isaiah. And the pasuk from Isaiah the prophet is, Urisem v'sas libchem. You will see and your heart will rejoice when you see the coming back to Israel of the Jewish people. And this was inscribed, he says, they dated it. The Israeli Antiquities Authorities, they dated it to the year 300, 400, 500, best you can do. And he turns to us and he says, this is a verse from Isaiah. Centuries later, a Jew inscribed this into a rock in the temple area so that you and I can read it 20 centuries later, or 1,600 years later. Is not your heart fluttering with joy right now? You are a complete fulfillment of that verse in Isaiah. And I got so tingly that second when it all came hitting me like that. It was just unbelievable and an incredible feeling. So that is our hope. The hope was that Rabbi Yehuda said, I'm not going to inflame anybody. We're under the boot of Rome. And so he left out Chanukah from the Mishnah for purely sensible reasons, because it's all about politics. You don't want to inflame and write anything incendiary against the guys who are in charge who can hurt you. But you and I, thank God, are not under that Roman boot right now. And we should hope and pray that with the Almighty's help, he should send Mashiach quickly, speedily in our days, because we're all very confused and we're suffering from a pandemic. May the Almighty have mercy on us. May we continue to light the holy lights of Chanukah. And may he send Mashiach Tzidkenu quickly and heal us and speedily, quickly in our days. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Amen. Thank you, Reb Shmuel. Amazing as always.
Very, very sweet. Thank you so much.
The blend of Torah and academia, true to the Plotsker approach.
We're working on it, right?
I'm loving it.
Right.
I think I shared this with you. I just want to get this on the recording as well. The whole point with the Chassam Sofer's suggestion, it's said in his name of that, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wouldn't make a Meseches Chanukah as not to give honor to the Chashmonoim who did not deserve honor because they unlawfully held on to the position as kings. So you mentioned the fact that that's really hard to believe of someone of the stature of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So I just want to share that I heard this idea once on a shir, and the lecturer, he kind of sidestepped your whole question by saying, and of course, this wasn't a vengeful act, that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would never do a thing like that, but rather Beruach Kodsho, through his Ruach HaKodesh, he determined that it was not appropriate, something to that effect. So that might tamper it a little bit. But nonetheless, fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. I wish you a Freilich and Chanukah, and we look forward to many more shiurim from Reb Shmuel.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Very kind. Thank you so much. Thank you for enabling me to be a part of it. Thank you so much.
A pleasure, of course. And thank you, Achihud, once again.
Thank you, Achihud. Thank you, Tyler. Hope everybody enjoyed it over there, too. Hope it was good.
That's right.
Welcome.